unanimous decision of this court is that the terms woman and sex in the Equality Act 2010 refer to a biological woman and biological sex.
What the heck is going on here? Well, on April 16th, 2025, the UK Supreme Court ruled that when the 2010 Equality Act refers to women, it's referring to biological women. Some people were thrilled. Others, not so much. So, what is a TERF? Officially, it stands for Trans, Exclusionary, Radical, Feminist. Originally, it described old-school feminists who opposed including biological males in women-only spaces. But today, TERF has expanded to mean, well, pretty much anyone who objects to treating a biological male as a woman in every situation. Amusingly, during this debate, the UK has even become known as TERF Island, due to the number of prominent women and women's rights groups that speak out on this issue. The history of trans rights in the UK is very different from the US, so let's untangle how this decision came about and what it means. It all started with the 2004 Gender Recognition Act. The UK wanted to codify rights for trans folks, and the 2004 Act created the concept of Gender Recognition Certificates, GRCs. GRCs were intended to support the original understanding of transgender folks. That is, people who had the condition now known as gender dysphoria, who needed to undergo these changes to live a happy and healthy life in society. The pretty extensive requirements to get a certificate were be at least 18 years old, have or have had gender dysphoria diagnosed, have lived in their acquired gender for at least 2 years, intend to live in their acquired gender for the rest of their life, submit medical reports from doctors, including evidence of transition and diagnosis, and finally, a decision by the Gender Recognition Panel. So after going through extensive procedures and evaluation, a person could receive a GRC and get the benefits of that and be treated as their desired sex, with some exceptions such as sports, rape centers, and prisons. For a few years, the GRC system meant that only men who were truly committed to living as a woman and had proven it could be legally treated as a woman and get access to some women's spaces that other biological men were barred from. Then, in 2010, came the Equality Act, aiming to simplify and unify discrimination laws, adding explicit protections for men, women, and trans people. It both incorporated the GRC and extended it to people who had not transitioned in any way, describing that as gender reassignment. While there was still technically a difference between having a GRC or not, this effectively gutted the GRC. Institutions began to ignore it and just went by a person's expressed intent, which came to be known as self-ID. And due to some weirdness in overlapping laws, a person couldn't be asked if they had a GRC. So even places trying to allow GRC folks in couldn't implement that since everyone had to be assumed to have a GRC. Eventually, activists pushed for the UK to officially recognize self-ID, with Ireland leading the way in 2015. And all hell broke loose. Women and lesbian groups began pointing out the impact on women's only spaces. This was perhaps best exemplified by the tale of the 29 lesbians. There was debate in Scottish Parliament about whether 29 lesbians could form a lesbian-only group. The response was no, they would have to accept men, unless perhaps the group was formed around a belief such as all lesbians are women. Then maybe. But what if there's a biological male who also believes all lesbians are women? Does he now get in? And the response was, good point, yeah, you'd probably be required to accept the man in that case. These are the kinds of parliamentary debates that actually happened. Scotland implemented quotas requiring women to make up 50% of all public boards, but then allowed men who self-identified as women to count toward that quota. Meaning, in theory, a 100% male board could still be totally compliant as having 50% women. An author called Kafka once wrote a book about this sort of thing. Much of the debate during this period was over whether trans folks should have to make efforts to be recognized, or if self-ID was sufficient and provided dignity and access to basic spaces without overriding others' rights. But while people were debating gyms and bathrooms, it was inevitable that far more serious cases would begin to test the boundaries. In 2023, a biological male on trial for multiple rapes declared that he was a woman and demanded to be placed in a women's prison, which he was. After her government had created all the conditions to make this possible, while continually insisting that self-ID would never result in anything negative happening, Scottish First Minister Nicola Sturgeon had to rapidly backtrack amid public outrage.
I don't see how it's possible to have a rapist within a female prison. Given the understandable public and parliamentary concern in this case, I can confirm to Parliament that this prisoner will not be incarcerated at Cornton Vale Women's Prison, and I hope that provides assurance to the public, Presiding Officer, not least to the victims in this particular case.
The backlash over this rapist being put in a women's prison contributed directly to the collapse of Sturgeon's government.
The SNP government ordered an urgent review on how double rapist Isla Bryson, formerly Adam Graham, was allowed into a women's prison. The case of this double rapist has been a huge scandal. At the last count, the First Minister had refused 12 times to say if Isla Bryson is a man or a woman. And it's important because that affects how public bodies treat these criminals when they're released from jail.
Critics had warned it would happen. Activists and officials insisted it never would. But it did. And Bryson was not the first, or the worst. In 2017, 2 years after Ireland adopted self-ID, the UK had already been forced to confront this nightmare. Stephen Wood, later calling himself Karen White, had a long criminal history that included indecent assault, indecent exposure, and child sex offenses. In 2015, Wood began saying he was a woman without doing any form of transition. In 2016, Wood violently raped a woman multiple times over a few months, leaving her fearing she might never have children because of the harm done to her genitals. In 2017, after a knife attack on a neighbor, Wood was arrested. He later claimed he warned the police not to place him in a woman's prison, but because he'd been saying he was a woman, they did so anyway. While at the prison, Wood began wearing a wig and fake breasts. Within 3 months, he raped 2 female inmates and sexually assaulted 2 others. Eventually, authorities decided a women's prison was not the place for him after all. Wood later wrote a letter saying that trans offenders like him should be banned from female prisons. He also said that for 3 months, all he saw was fear in the faces of his fellow female inmates. The scandal from this led the UK government to create a special transgender inmate unit. With all this swirling around over the years and the debates getting more and more intense, the UK Supreme Court took up the issue, reviewed the Equality Act, and solved the situation without changing a single word.
The unanimous decision of this court is that the terms woman and sex in the Equality Act 2010 refer to a biological woman and biological sex.
All trans rights remained, all women's rights remained, all men's rights remained. The Supreme Court didn't abolish trans rights or remove any existing protections. They simply clarified that women in the Equality Act means biological women, just as men means biological men. They pointed out this was clearly the original intent, as women were given pregnancy and maternal rights that wouldn't make any sense for a biological male. A trans person has trans rights, and the rights of their biological sex, but not the rights of the other sex. Trans women still retain legal protections for transgender status, such as employment and healthcare, but they do not become biologically female in the eyes of the law, and biological women don't lose the right to female-only spaces if that's what they prefer. Any woman's service can decide whether it makes sense for them to include trans folks, but they aren't required to do so. In short, the court ruled that words mean what they have always meant, and no special documents can change that. Now is a good time to point out that in many ways, this decision and debate have nothing to do with trans folks. It has to do with what rights biological women have and whether any biological male can choose to take advantage of a right to intrude on female spaces for illicit purposes. All the examples I've provided here involve non-trans males exploiting the system to gain access to vulnerable women or to game rules intended to promote equality, like Scotland's public board quotas. This wasn't so much of an issue back when the GRC was relevant because the extensive requirements and vetting meant a non-trans male predator was very unlikely to try for or get a certificate. But as self-ID became a thing, these men taking advantage of it was inevitable, and society had to respond to protect women. There are other issues, of course, like the question of sports. But what I focused on here is what I think is the most important question, a question which the UK Supreme Court has settled. Now the country is going through a process of absorbing the decision and what it means. The 29 lesbians are finally free to have their book club and to choose for themselves whether they want biological men to join. The public board in Scotland must actually have 50% women. Biological men like Bryson and Wood can no longer go into a women's rape center, hospital ward, or prison, no matter how much they want to. The Gordian knot was cut, and TERF Island became a land of peace and honey once again, never to return to the ancient ways.